Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, Damsels and Dingbats, to another episode of Doin' the D. Actually, it is an extension of our last episode, where we were taking a look at the Henry Ford Museum of American Innovation. When we were last here, we took a look at the automotive and locomotive areas of the museum. Today we're going to pick up, and we're going to start by looking at Heroes of the Sky. This is the aviation portion of the museum. Now, just inside the entrance of the exhibit is a Ford Flivver. These were introduced in 1927. They weren't actually put through production. There were only 5 of them built, and this one on display happens to be the last surviving one, and it actually was the original prototype. Here we take another look at the DC-3 hanging over the lobby, which can be seen when you first enter the museum. This beauty, known as the Tin Goose, is actually a Ford Trimotor. It was not the first aircraft to be made entirely out of metal, but it was designed and built so well that it was one of those that actually convinced skeptics that metal was, a good way to go with aircraft. This particular craft was actually flown over the South Pole, carrying Admiral Byrd in 1929. Now, this insane-looking plane is actually the Dayton Wright Flyer 1920. The plane was constructed with balsa wood from its fuselage and its wings, and it was covered in plywood and varnished linen. It had a max speed of 165 miles an hour. Can you say no thanks? An interesting story on this one. The pilot, Howard Reinhardt, actually fell out of the plane, plummeting 1,800 feet to the ground. He landed in a cemetery and survived with only major bruises and a fractured hip. I'm saying no thanks. I don't know about you. Here we have a 1925 Fokker F-7 trimotor airplane called the Josephine. This was actually named after Henry Ford's granddaughter, his only son, Edsel Ford, his daughter. This particular plane was used in the 1926 Arctic North Pole expedition, which is said to have made Richard Byrd the first person to the North Pole, or the first person to fly to the North Pole. Now, there is a controversy on whether this was actually the case or not, but we're not going to get into that here. Here we see a depiction of what was once called barnstorming. This was a form of entertainment in which stunt pilots performed tricks, standing on the wings, things like that. These types of displays were also often called flying circuses. Next, we have a 1909, I believe it's pronounced Blériot 11 monoplane. This was small enough to be taken apart and shipped anywhere. It could be reassembled from drawings with basic tools in about 9 hours. Behind it, we see Igor Sigorsky's first helicopter, which he donated to the Edison Institute in 1943 by actually landing it on the lawn to deliver it. Here we see a Pitcairn PCA autogyro. This weird hybrid of plane and helicopter was first flown in 1931. There were only 79 of them ever produced, and this particular one, the PCA-2, the Detroit News #2, was actually the first. The Detroit News was actually the first news organization to adopt a rotary winged aircraft for their news reporting. Interesting fact: the Detroit News #2 is one of only 2 remaining autogyros known to still exist. Here we have a Boeing Model 40. These were airmail planes, and also used as just general air. 3 original Model 40s exist, one of which is still airworthy. The one depicted here is a 2-passenger model that bears the colors of the Boeing Air Transport Company. Here we have another aircraft used by the Detroit News. This is a Lockheed Vega. Next to it, a 1927 Stinson Detroiter monoplane, the pride of Detroit. This is Charles Lindbergh's Spirit of St. Louis. Interesting fact on this one, the first time Henry Ford ever flew in an airplane was in this plane. This interesting exhibit, you could actually walk inside. It actually, if you start at the back and make your way forward, it shows the difference between what the inside cabins look like for passengers. This is the DC-3. This is what the inside of a DC-3 looks like. Obviously, it's padded seats. It's a little bit larger, and then you make your way forward, and you can see that the earlier models, they had the little wicker chairs that weren't even mounted. Drastic difference between the two. I thought that was kind of cool to get a look at that. Here we see another tri-motor airplane. This is the 1928 Ford 4ATB, named the Floyd Bennett, flown over the South Pole by Richard E. Byrd. The tri-motor was the most popular airliner of the late 1920s and 1930s. It was ruggedly dependable and led Richard Byrd to choose a tri-motor for his attempt to be the first person to fly over the South Pole. On November 28th and 29th of 1929, Byrd and his crew of 3 achieved that goal in this plane. And what would a museum concerning airplanes be without the 1903 Wright Flyer? Now, this is just a replica, mind you. This copy of the 1903 Flyer faithfully replicates the original aircraft. In December of 2003, the replica attempted to duplicate the original's flight at Kill Devil Hills in North Carolina, but the attempt was foiled by bad weather. The replica did fly successfully in earlier tests. After finishing the aviation section, which is, along with the automobiles and the locomotives, all in all about a third of the museum, I began to realize just how big of a project this was going to be. The term "bitten off more than you can chew" is definitely coming to mind as my back pain started to kick in from doing all the walking. So you'll have to forgive me as I record the next few portions of the museum. I'm speeding up. I'm more focused on trying to show you all what's there, and I kind of lose focus on the details. So I kind of feel ashamed that I moved so fast and I really didn't take time to linger too much on any given thing, because there is literally a wealth of knowledge in this museum. Everything has a story connected to it. Everything has a reason for being there, and I felt so rushed, like I needed to get all this on film so you guys could get some idea of what all was in this massive building. And perhaps in the future I'll go back and spend some more time on the areas that I skimmed over. But until then, please do not take offense if I skipped over a section that you deem more important than I did, or if you'd like to see more in any given area, feel free. Let me know. I will gladly do more recordings of those areas next time I go through. There's just so much to see in this museum, and honestly, a lot of it, I didn't know anything about any of it. As I said, I wasn't taking time to really stop and enjoy it, or take it in, or learn anything. I was just purely on record mode. So, again, please forgive me, for the pace that we're setting here. I'm, not only was I trying to get as much footage as possible for the video, but now that I'm editing it, I'm trying to get as much into this half-hour video as possible. At any rate, what we've been looking at here is a section called Made in America Manufacturing, and what we're basically seeing is a collection of artifacts from the 18th through 20th centuries, dealing and documenting the American manufacturing ingenuity and whatnot. The Made in America exhibit has three major sections titled Making Things, Making Power, and Making Choices. Uh, the exhibits are set up a lot like a maze. That's kind of what it felt like, but they have well over 1,500 artifacts, which include, but by no stretch of the imagination, are limited to the Edison dynamo. They have different kinds of power engines, electrical generating devices like the Newcomen engine. They have a gas steam engine from 1916 used to generate electricity at Highland Park, the Highland Park plant. They have rotating steam engines. They've got all kinds of different kinds of industrial tools, from the Maudsley production lathe, you name it. It's just there's so much stuff in this part of the museum alone that if you don't stop, slow down, and take the time to look at these things closely and take in their stories. I mean, right now we're just powering through this stuff, and I'm not doing any of this any justice. For that, like I said, I really apologize. But I mean, I don't know what half of this stuff is. I'm sure most of us don't. But like I said, every single piece has a story, and it just this is one of those places that you have to go check it out for yourself, and it's gonna take you all day. And if you take your time and enjoy it and try to take some stuff in, I guarantee you're not going to do the whole museum in one day like I did. The only way you're going to get through this place, in 5 or 6 hours, is by virtually running from one end to the other, which is clearly what I did for this video. Alright, so moving on from the smaller tools of the trade in the Making Things section, we now move on to the Making Power section. Now, the last area we were in dealt largely in manufacturing goods. This obviously focuses more on the production of power. Now, I don't know the last thing about any of these devices, other than that they are huge, they are impressive, and I would be absolutely remiss in my duties making this video if I were to leave them out. So, here they are. I mean, we've got steam engines and all kinds of just different ways of producing energy, and I wish I could tell you what any given one of them are. Honestly, they all look the same to me. I mean, obviously they each have their differences, but they're all massive chunks of moving metals that have something to do with making power. So perhaps this will be one of those areas that I examine a little closer next time I go in, but for now, we'll just take a quick look at some of the devices and move on, shall we? Now, don't worry. Looking at these contraptions, I was just as confused as you are now. I mean, clearly they're important. Clearly they're massive. And they're metal. Yeah, I don't know what else to say about it. But hey, look. Just while I'm starting to feel hopelessly confused, I see something I recognize. So, let's go take a look over here at the firearms and the windmill and the firearms. Now, we are all familiar with quote-unquote guns. But I guarantee you haven't seen some of these. Now, I didn't get in close enough to get a whole lot of details on the makes and models. Like I said, at this point, I was just trying to get as much video coverage as possible. But definitely some nice pieces. I guarantee you any one of them's worth more money than I've ever seen. Some pretty funky looking ones in there too. That revolver down there. The freaking long ass barrel. Some of these shotguns look more like rifles to me, but, you know, shows what I know. Here's my favorite part. I've always been a blade person. I love knives, edges, blades, swords, whatever, you know. It's always been my thing. These, I always laughed at these. If these are shotguns, I mean, I've always imagined a shotgun as like a close range weapon, right? Obviously, everything I know is wrong. Handmade rifles. Can you imagine making these by hand? Can you imagine trying to wield some of these by hand? I need a tripod just to hold up the end of some of these things. And just when I was feeling comfortable that I was back in an area I thought I was familiar with, we find ourselves here with milling machines. Now, I'm not sure what milling has to do with firearms, you know, exactly. But, you know, kind of find it weird that those cases of firearms were just like right there in the middle of all this big machinery. I imagine milling has something to do with barrels and the metal in the firearms and stuff like that. But I'm no expert, so I really couldn't tell you exactly. But, I mean, here we're looking at baseball paraphernalia. I mean, it's just like... This I'm actually familiar with. This is actually the first Henry Ford assembly line, which, you know, I always, as a child, when I was taught about the assembly line, I didn't quite imagine it being this simple. You know, I was always thinking like the large rubber conveyor belts and electric motors and whatnot, but apparently it was a lot simpler than that. Now, in the last video, I mentioned how this museum has a path that you should follow from, you know, point A to point B to point C, and there's a logical progression to the exhibits, and they make sense. And I explained to you guys how apparently I did not follow that progression, because we went from power production to firearms to milling equipment and the assembly line. And now we're in an Abraham Lincoln exhibit and talking about Lincoln and his life and the Civil War and his fight against slavery. We got a lot of political documentation and war paraphernalia. All very interesting stuff. But my mind at this point is still trying to figure out why the guns were next to the steam engines. You add into that the fact that I'm going along as fast as I can, trying to record as much as I can, and at this point, I'm thoroughly freaking confused. I'm lost. Right now, all this is to me is a recording session. So, if you go to this museum and you get the map before they let you in, like there's this gal that'll stop you, or you know there'll be a person there that'll stop you and they'll ask you if you've ever been here, and you know la la la, and then they give you a map and they suggest that you follow the route. I also suggest that you follow the route. So anyway, as I said, here we are in the Lincoln exhibit, and I'm trying to get images of as much as possible while I'm in here, but there is so much, and at this point everything is very minute. I don't know, that's not the word. There's small articles and items, and as you can see there's little tags with writing on them and books with writing in them, and none of it's really showing up too well on my phone camera. So, you know, hopefully you can appreciate the value of some of the items and what they represent. But if I was to take the time and research every image and every document and try to give you a rundown on what everything was, like we did with the planes, this portion of the museum alone would run at least 2 or 3 episodes. Now, seeing as a large portion of the end of the Lincoln exhibit dealt with his role against slavery, it would make sense, obviously, that the next portion of the museum leads you into an exhibit on civil rights. Now, I am not racist, and I can appreciate, though I can't imagine, the amount of pain and suffering that the segregated had to go through. But this little part of the museum right here really, I don't know, it pissed me off. Like, I grew up and I was taught about, you know, like that right there, the white only drinking fountains or the white only bathrooms. But stepping into this tiny little segregated waiting room, it just, I don't know, it was wrong on so many levels. I mean, were people really stupid enough back then to not realize that we're all human beings? I mean, and at the same time, like I said, I can appreciate this as part of our history. And it, as much as people want to ignore it, it can't be forgotten because it needs to be learned from. But at the same time, I feel like a hypocrite because I'm powering through most of this and not looking closely at any of it to share it with you. And that really makes me feel bad. But this part right here really excited me. I grew up watching historical documentation, being taught stories, you know, about this bus and about how in 1955 this woman named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a bus to a white passenger just because he was white. Now, you know, you hear stories like this and you're taught these historical lessons and these things like this bus. It's this artifact, this thing, this lore in your mind that you can imagine. You've seen it in books, you've seen it on TV, but to actually be here, standing in this bus, the very same bus that Rosa Parks was in, I don't know why, but that was one of the most emotionally touching moments that I have had in my life. Let alone, you know, it doesn't matter. It's in a museum or the, you know, whatever. It's just, you know, later on I had to go catch up with Tara, and I caught back up with her at this point because, like I said, I kind of roamed way out ahead of her trying to get the recordings done. But I met back up with her at this point, and we actually sat down on the bus while you know, one of these tour guide ladies spoke to us about, you know, the past, for, you know, basically telling us everything that we already had learned growing up. But I'm sitting here thinking, wow, I am sitting in that bus. In that moment, it went from being a story out of a history lesson to becoming real, and it blew my mind. Now, across from the Civil Rights exhibit, there was a Women's Equality and Rights to Vote exhibit, which I did go through, and I did get video footage of it, but in going through to put this movie together, I can't find the footage, so I'm not sure if it didn't survive the transfer from my phone to the computer, or if I've just misplaced it somewhere. But just keep in mind that exhibit is available should you visit, and it does have a lot of very interesting information in it, just as important as any of the other exhibits. Don't misconstrue my lack of video as meaning I'm opinionated one way or the other on the subject. Here, next, we have an interesting exhibit called Your Place in History. Now, this interesting little exhibit almost felt like a living timeline. What it was each decade had its own little section and was filled with things from that decade. You know, popular art, uh, types of entertainment, clothing, and whatnot. I found Tara, of course, in the '80s section, as she is a child of the '80s, standing in that bedroom looking around. She kind of had this "I never want to leave" look in her eyes. Of course, I was drawn immediately next door to the '90s era, just because, you know, I was born in '79, so I technically grew up in the '80s. I guess I could say I was an '80s kid myself, but I do more associate with the '90s. So the things that were in that section of the exhibit had more meaning to me. They brought back a lot of memories, and of course, the further back you went in time, uh, you could actually see the people who were looking at different parts of the exhibit were kind of uh, separating themselves out. You know, the further down the timeline you went, the older the individuals were that were reminiscing over the items. So it was definitely a very nostalgic exhibit, and very fun. Kind of gave you a sense of what life was kind of like for the generations before yours and after, and seeing all of the generations kind of mingling back and forth, and appreciating those things that you had when you were, you know, in that decade. That was kind of cool too. One part of the exhibit was actually this classroom, and it kind of blew my mind there for a minute, because it looked a lot like the classrooms I used to be in when I was a child, like like grade school. Obviously, things started to change about my middle school years, early '90s and whatnot. But it's just kind of funny how everything can kind of be put into perspective. I mean, the further back I went, back past the '80s and the '70s, the '60s, and so forth, the further back I went from the '80s and '90s, the more classic things felt. You know, I wasn't familiar with any of it beyond what I'd seen in movies or heard, you know, tale from my parents, and it just didn't seem as real, because I didn't experience it firsthand. But then you have these kids who come from 2000s on, who are standing in the '80s and '90s area looking at stuff with just this confused look on their face. And it's like, I think just one kid actually pointed at this game. I think it was the Simon Says game or whatever. I remember I had one of these as a kid, and he asked his dad. He's like, "What's that?" And his dad was trying to explain to him that it was this game that, you know, it lit up and you had to hit the buttons in the right colors and all of that. And I'm sitting here thinking, the game's not that old. I mean, it came out when I was in like middle school. I mean, really. And the kid's like, "Oh, like it's some ancient artifact they dug up out of freaking some ruins somewhere." And then the kid just walks up like, "Oh, that's dumb. You know, I can do that on my phone." You know, I was just like I said, it puts things in perspective. The things that are important to us, that we hold on to and we cherish memory wise, the further separated future generations get from that, it loses its meaning and its value and its place. And I think this exhibit does a real good job of bringing people together and letting them experience things from different perspectives. And if you get a chance to go, and you only get the chance to see a couple exhibits in this museum, I would strongly suggest finding this exhibit and just taking a stroll through. See where you stand in this timeline of things. Well, there I went and got sucked up into that topic there, and I've allowed the video to run on. What we're looking at now is an exhibit called the Dymaxion House. And remember earlier I told you that this facility was large enough it actually had a house in it? Well, this is that house. Now, the Dymaxion House was developed by an inventor named Buckminster Fuller. And he invented this house to address what at the time was perceived as shortcomings with the way they built their houses, you know, back then. Back then being, 1930-ish. Fuller designed this house, which was intended to be as environmentally friendly and resource efficient as possible. They were designed as kits. Basically, they put the kits together at the production facility, and then they were really easy to ship, and then they were actually assembled on site. Unfortunately, the design was just a little too far ahead of its own time. The ability to create homes out of aluminum back then was just a little too expensive. So the plans, it never really took off. Next, nearing the end of our journey through this massive museum, we enter a neck of the woods a little more familiar to me. The agricultural area. Here they have a large collection of varied types of harvesting equipment, planting equipment, just general agricultural tools. I mean, here we got a couple cute little playhouses, perhaps chicken coops. I'm not sure. They had kids playing in them, so I just assumed they were for kids. But it's really near the dining area over there too. So, but a lot of this farm equipment, like this buck wagon here, you're not going to see in use anymore. It's either been replaced by more up-to-date, more efficient equipment, or it's just, nobody needs it anymore. But it's definitely a fitting subject matter to have here at the Ford Museum, as Ford's pretty much synonymous with motorized vehicles of all kinds. A lot of these tractors and combines and harvesters and you name it. I mean, they're as much a part of American history as the automobiles and the airplanes and everything else. And if you're even if you're not a farmer, I mean, it doesn't take any knowledge of farming to appreciate the technology in the agricultural field has advanced just as far and just as significantly as in every other field that we've looked at, whether it be technology or social or art. It's all important, and the museum has made it a point to give attention to the subject. So, I mean, there's quite a few interesting pieces here. Yeah, I think I've seen a couple of these on children's books when I was a kid. Old MacDonald had a farm. Look at this old piece of rusty steam equipment that doesn't work anymore sitting on the back cover. But yeah, this is one of the exhibits. There's not a lot to be said about it. It is what it is. Here's the Oscar Mayer car. And that's pretty cool. But anyway, the farm equipment, it's one of the exhibits. I tried to cover as many of the exhibits as possible. I think I did a pretty thorough job of getting everything. But it's one of those things that's, instead of going into a 40-minute conversation about farm equipment, here's some farm equipment. And in the same vein, what we're looking at now is they decided to take a look at kitchens. For some reason, how the household kitchen has evolved over the centuries, and most people wouldn't stop to consider something like this to be of any interest. But when you're standing there looking at it, I mean, it's kind of cool. I mean, look at all these old stoves and these lights. Who gives a crap about stoves and lights and dollhouses? They're cool dollhouses, and I take a moment to look closely at each and every one of them. I do not personally care even the slightest about dollhouses, but somebody took the time
to handcraft each and every one of these, and some of them are better than others, in my opinion. Um, just as, somebody took the time to gather each and every one of those wood burning stoves over there and bring them in one place and set them up on display for people to look at and, to admire. I mean, there's something to be said about an old dollhouse. I mean, somebody's kid used to play with this thing and value it and treasure it, and it's a piece of history. The wood burning stove. Who knows who used that to cook their dinner, or what vital role it may have played, what kind of conversations it may have overheard, held nearby. The questions like this come into your mind about silly little things like that. The barbecue's a little out of place. I mean, mine's better, and the poster bed thing here, yeah, I don't know. I don't know about that, man. Those are just chairs. This part here's pretty cool. They, just like they did with the vehicle, they pulled apart and wire suspended a chair. Now that's kind of weird. Like, okay, so it's an ergonomic chair. Am I really that interested in how it's put together? No, but they did it, and I'm gonna look at it because it's cool. All this old furniture here. I'm a lot more interested in the cars and the airplanes, but some of this furniture is just like, it's old, and some, a lot of it's handcrafted. And then of course, they do their little the timeline, so you can see how furniture's evolved and whatnot, and you may be sitting here thinking, why do I care about a chair or a stove or that thing there that looks like a space toilet? It's actually a mold that they used to make those plastic chairs. What do I care about any of this stuff? Well, maybe you don't. I don't. I could give or take this, but I'm sure there's somebody out there that's watching this at some point, and they're going, wow, this stuff's just amazing. I wish you would have stopped and talked about it. Well, unfortunately, this is not an area I could have stopped and said anything about, because these items are just on display. Like that old TV, that's cool. Try to play your PlayStation on that sucker. But anyway, a lot of this stuff's just on display to be on display. There aren't really any like right there. There's a board that you can read that kind of talks about what's on display. But most of this stuff, it's just on display. There's nothing talking about it. So, I mean, if you're interested in how many different kinds of chairs there are, look at that old rocking chair. That's cool. That old writing table. There's something to be said about furniture. I mean, it's got character. It's got history. Maybe growing up you had that chair right there in the front room. And seeing it now brings you back to that reminiscent time, and you're like, oh, that's just cool. Maybe that's what it's all about. Well, I hate to say it because this place is awesome, but thank God this video series is done. This is the longest Doing the D I have done yet, and I apologize if the content value was wanting. As I said, I was really trying to get as much recorded for you all to see as possible, even including chairs. But again, if there's anything you'd like me to go over again, maybe look at a little more closely and record, I would gladly do so. Just let me know. Leave a comment in the comment section below, and let me know what you'd like me to go look at. And next time I'm up there, I'll make sure to check you off the list and get a video up for you. But for now, that is well past the time that we have allocated for the video, so we're going to go ahead and bring this one to a close. And we'll see you next time. Until then, I've been your host, DM Avion, saying stay safe, have fun. I'm out.